Welcome back to Withum's video series, The Alternative Route. Today we're talking with Chris Lombardy, President at Salus GRC, and Rich Fuchs, Audit Partner in our Financial Services practice here at Withum. Chris and Rich, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So today we wanted to discuss some of the things you're seeing in the market as it relates to compliance and the regulatory landscape within the industry. Chris, whether our alternative investment clients are undergoing a regulatory exam themselves or really just want to stay current on what the regulators are looking at, what are some of the areas of focus that you're seeing in exams right now?
Yeah, sure. And great question. Again, thank you for having me join. It's really interesting. And I think the depth of what regulators are asking for has expanded quite a bit. And I think it's also important to understand there's sort of different types of exams that the Division of Examinations does. You'll hear a lot about a new registrant exam, or maybe it's an advisor that recently registered with the SEC, or it may be an exam of a long-standing advisor. So I think that comes into play. But I think in both, there's sort of certain things that are sort of must-dos and must be able to demonstrate. For instance, attestations. Make sure when you put your compliance program in place, if there's something like each year or each quarter, our staff must attest that they continue to abide by the compliance program. Collect those things. I always say, do the easy things right. I think some of the must-haves, though, especially for private fund managers, satisfying that custody rule, right? So a lot of managers satisfy that by getting their audits done, getting those audits out in the designated time, usually by the end of April each year, 120 days. Fund of funds may be a little longer, but doing that type of thing, making sure, you're doing your annual compliance review that you're required to do, documenting that, doing good testing around that. And I'd also say, I think 2 or 3 more key areas, fees and expenses. I probably haven't seen an exam in many years where that is not an area of focus, where it's, how do we collect our fees? What are we collecting fees for? And on the expense side, what are we in particular charging to the funds, to the client? And if there's multiple funds, that there's sort of appropriate allocation there. And then even factor in, we see a lot of SMA clients for advisors now. Will they pay an expense that maybe a fund will they not? So I think those are big. And then the last 2, I'd say marketing materials, key focus. We know these new marketing rules took effect a few years ago. So there's a lot of focus on the content of the marketing materials and adhering to those rules. And then I think the last one I'll point out, Colleen, is really research. What's our research process look like? Do we use alternative data vendors, expert networks, acquired data, going to kind of the concept of material non-public info and how we deal with that. So there's some sort of key ones, I think, that no matter what type of advisor to what type of fund you see in most exams.
So you touched on fees and expenses a little bit, but for some of our emerging managers and, they're getting themselves structured and set up with funds and agreements, are there any common issues that you're noting in that area?
I think first off, the key thing on the expenses is, especially for newer managers, when you're working with your lawyers to put your offering documents together, there's a section in there on what expenses may be allocated to the private fund or funds. And I think a lot of people just assume, hey, the lawyers will handle that. But that's where I really think it's important to be involved in the drafting process and reviewing that, which most lawyers will tell you to review. I think the importance is to actually look at it and think ahead, right? So maybe today when we launch, we may not be charging something to a fund, but down the road we may, right? I use the example of expert network groups, right? Today we may not use them, but down the road we may. I think the other interesting thing we're seeing in the industry is a lot of people, the use of sort of the outsourced CFO operation providers. Is that a fund expense? Is it management company expense? Making sure that's properly documented so we don't run into a challenge down the road. So I think that's really the important thing is really put in there what you think may be an expense to the funds one day. And being involved in that drafting process and adhering to it, right? Because if something's not provided in those documents, it's probably not right to put that through without maybe getting that consent from the investors, which is not the easiest thing to do always.
Yeah, agreed, Chris. I think that's a really good point. There's probably a common theme throughout a lot of these questions, and it relates to documentation, right? And as an auditor, we love documentation, and so when we're looking and having conversations with our clients, we tend to tell them that, to your point, if it's not documented initially from the startup of the fund, to really make sure that you memorialize any changes to your policies as you're going through, and whether it's some kind of a resolution or some kind of document, ensuring that is there and supportable, just in case a regulator does walk through the door and they want to see why all of a sudden these changes were made. And likewise, too, as the auditor of the fund, when we come in, if there's any kind of changes in those expenses or how they're being allocated to the investors, we want to be able to point to something as well as the manager to say, hey, this is how all this has changed. So, I think it's critical to make sure that the managers are continuing to document, memorialize all of their policies and procedures to keep it consistent year over year.
And Rich, I may just add to that. I think, as you all kind of start your work in, say, October to get the year-end audit done, and part of your audit is looking at expenses and things like that. But that's something I think Chief Compliance Officer should be doing along the course of the year too, whether it's 2, 3, 4 times sampling some expenses, right? Especially when there's allocation, right? Multiple funds or sort of split paying, whether it be some to the fund, some to the manager. But testing that, looking at the actual invoice, looking at the internal approvals of who the advisor has to approve expenses, the involvement of the administrator. I think all that is great. Makes your job easier come year end, and people can get audits done quicker, get them out. But I think the examiners appreciate that as well, that testing.
Thank you. Please stay tuned for the continued discussion on key compliance insights with Chris and Rich on our next episode of The Alternative Route.